Thank you very much for your question, Luca. I do agree we need more initiatives to raise the voter turnout of young people. We do see young people are more interested in self-organization type of participation, for example, social media activism or signing petitions or going to the streets with Fridays for Future. But while initiatives like this time of voting are really great, I think we should also lower the age of participation for existing mechanisms. For example, the European Citizens Initiative. I think that from age 16 and 17, all young people should be able to sign an ECI that is important to them, and that way they can also have their voice be heard, as well as lowering the voting age to 16.
I think it's a really great question because it is one of the problems that we're struggling with as young people in Europe is that sometimes young people find it easier at least to engage in newer forms of participation. Young people go to protests, they're active online, they debate. But sometimes you're right, there is lacking participation in these formal electoral systems. And those are really important, right? Because a lot of power is centered with the people who make our laws. So I absolutely think that it's key that young people turn out. Some of the things we're working with in the European Youth Forum is making the vote even more accessible. We want to lower the voting age to 16. This has been done successfully in some European countries, such as Austria. And we really believe that bringing young people into the process as early as possible is, first of all, their human right, but more importantly, or as importantly, will also help young people gain the habit of democratic participation. I think the political parties have a huge responsibility in making sure that we're talking about youth-centered issues. Because if you turn on the television and you see a bunch of old men, sadly, debating the retirement age or whatever, then maybe you're less inclined to participate than if they're talking about youth participation, if they're at the local level, if they're talking about schooling, if they're talking about culture. Young people care about everything, but not enough politicians are speaking to the issues that young people care the very most about. So we're trying to work with political parties who are working with their manifestos right now for the European Parliament election to really ensure that the issues that young people care about, access to quality education, access to quality jobs early in your career, take center stage at the European Parliament elections. But no matter what, we only get the change that we ourselves create. So, Luca, I hope you vote if you're old enough to vote. If you're not, then I hope we manage to lower the voting age so that you are. And even if you can't, then organize, join civil society, join your student council or a scout troop or an exchange organization or even a political youth party and get involved with the democratic process. Get your friends, your fellow young people out there to the polls because we need to lower the average age at the European Parliament. And Luca, I think you're going to help us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very relevant question. I was just in Switzerland, in Lucerne, actually, for the past 3 days at a conference called the Europa Forum, and the whole focus was on that. The theme was young ideas for the old continent. So I think it's something that even the boomer generation or those in power right now are aware of, which is good. I think just that awareness is in itself already a step forward. I think it's important because we do have to pass the baton in terms of interest, political interest, in terms of accessibility, information to millennials and people in Generation Z. If you look at civil society organizations, even my own Stand Up for Europe, just next week, we're starting a new European project called Make Your Vote, along with organizations in Bulgaria, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and here in Belgium, where we're based. And it's all about that. It's all about interviews, simulations, roundtable discussions about what the priorities of young people are leading up to the 2024 parliamentary elections, European parliamentary elections. And you read the stats about how more people are inclined to vote in national elections. But I think now with the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, all of these things, I think older generations in power and young people are realizing that you do need a European and EU push So I think if anything positive is coming out of these crises, obviously awful, and it shouldn't have taken these crises, but if anything positive comes out of that, I think there is now more of a push of we need change now, and who's going to do that? The younger generations. So yeah, it's a step in the right direction.
I would just love to see more initiatives by political parties and political representatives of meeting up with young people to really, well, to have the engaged dialogue with young people, so that, because I think that it is a thing that could be bridged. I mean, age is not an absolute category. They need to meet with one another. So that is the first response. Claims for new ways of finding productive dialogues between young people and political representatives. And the second thing is that I'm just kind of longing for new parties to be inaugurated. I'm just longing for youth parties. I mean, why wouldn't that be a lovely idea? I mean, 30 years ago, there were no green parties, but now there are green parties. So there could be different parties. So youth parties, that would be a very important way of channeling young people's views into the political system. And since parties is the main thing in representative democracy, well, party innovation would be a great thing.
Thanks for your question, Mariana. I think that if we put different groups of people in different boxes, saying that all young people vote progressive, all older people vote conservative, we're not going to get the responses from politicians that really reflect the diversity of all of our needs. Because after all, there are conservative young people and there are progressive older people, even if maybe this is not the trend. So the best way to make sure that all the diversity of views is heard is not to put people in these boxes. And that way, then politicians will look at an individual as an individual and not just as one person who's representing the views of a whole group of people, because we do have diversity in views. And on your question on how we can get younger people more interested in politics, I think the best way to do that is to relate politics to their daily life. And that's, for example, even in the way that the trash and waste management system is being managed in your local city and in your region. This is also a political decision, for example. So connecting daily life to politics is a good way to connect politics and raise the importance of politics with young people.
I think your question raises so many things, right? And I think one thing that's really key, we talked a little bit before about how to center youth issues in politics and in the last question. So I think what I really am going to take away from your question is this idea of competing interests, of conflicting life situations, conflicting life choices and generalizations. I think that that's such a key element, because really one of the troubles we have in European democracy, actually in global democracy right now, is this polarization, right? It's this belief that disagreement has to lead to conflict, and it's this system where we feel each other living in almost different information spaces. At the Youth Forum, we work a lot with intergenerationality. We work a lot with the idea that by bringing different groups together in the same dialogue, we can really be better, all of us, at listening to each other's interests. But it's especially crucial for young people because they're so often left out of the policy-making spaces. So I think we have dialogue projects ongoing, but we know also in the institutions they're really in the Commission beginning to work with this idea of intergenerationality, this idea that any policy needs to be not just for the people who are in power right now, but also the people who will make up democracy in 20 years or in 50 years. And if we want to get really radical about it with the foresight thinking, then how do we also make sure that the policy is just and fair to the people who haven't even been born yet? And such an interesting challenge, and it's such an important challenge, because sometimes there are just conflicting living situations. And there's only so many resources in society to go around. But we really have to make sure, from the perspective of young people, that youth-friendly information is available, that we are taught in educational systems through non-formal education, civil society, how to engage with these different informational spheres, right? So I think your question really points a sore finger a finger at a sore spot, because we're just now developing those ideas in the European political debate.
It's a complex question, but also important, because again, like I said to Luca, the shift of the boomer generation post-war, and then now the millennials and the Generation Z, I think it's important to recognize the advantages of each generation, because that's how cooperation is fostered. So, the older generations, obviously, they have more capital, they have more funds. And in order to make these like systemic changes, unfortunately, being realistic in a capitalistic society, you need those funds, you need that economic incentive. But the younger generations, what is our advantage is we have urgency. I think especially in the climate crisis, we have that urgency of now we're seeing the effects, we're seeing sea levels rise, all of these things, and climate migration. And so putting those two together, I think, is important. So the know-how, the experience of the older generations, along with the financial pushes, because, we need corporations and governments to accept taking these financial blows, because it's a huge change and, loss in profits and things like that. But also our generations have a lot of influence, whether that's through social media or just in general. I think we're good at banding together, as you're seeing around the world, support for Iran, in Europe with Ukraine. So I think it's good to try to fuse as best we can. I know it's easier said than done, but try to fuse these two groups, more than two, but that have these different skills. And also, I think it's important that people in positions of power politically, whether at the national level or European level, focus on intentionally employing youth. Because if you look at, accredited parliamentary assistants or people like that, even they're in their late 20s, early 30s. So I think, how do we even push that younger, right? It's important to get people right out of school, or, extremely young people involved from an early age, because that's how they move up and make changes.
First of all, representation is lousy generally. So once again, political parties need to innovate very much more to be more capable of mirroring the breadth of ideas among citizenry generally, and that goes not only for young in comparison to old. You have other dimensions like well-educated, less educated people in the cities and people in the rural countryside. And we know, and that is the main problem overall in democracy in the times that we are living, that people are with lesser education, more rural setting, are feeling less represented than others. So I think that is an overall takeaway. A better functioning representation would also be a good thing for young people being represented, and for the balancing and weighing between old and young, and between different political views. So that is the second point. People are talking about polarization as a problem, and I tend to disagree. Democracy, polarization is a natural thing. We have different views, we have different ideas and longings, and that's the breeding ground for democracy. So it's more a matter of tolerance and respect for other people's views and claims and interests. So I think that is the second thing that I'm thinking about here. It's not a quick solution kind of answer to this young person, but it is a perspective, at least, that we should hopefully in the future be better to represent different ages, interests, and ideas. And then, one thing we have had recent elections in Sweden and for that matter in Italy too this year. And it is amazing because many young people have been voting very conservative, very nationalistic. So you couldn't assume that young people are radical or progressive or liberal, even though there's some trends are saying that they are. But with these examples from recent elections in Europe, you couldn't assume that young people are more progressive or radical and older people are more conservative. So I think that is also an important takeaway that also hangs together with my previous comment that, well, there is a breadth of democracy is about breadth of ideas, interests, and that is what we will have to live with. And maybe it could be comforting for a young person to think about not only is age the main difference between an individual and an older individual. I mean, interests and ideas would vary across age too.
I 100% agree with you, Jordan. I would also be in favor of lowering the age to vote to 16. We see that this generation of young people is the most informed generation maybe ever. And that's, of course, thanks to the age of technology and all of the wealth of information that's out there. But while I'm in favor of lowering the age to vote to 16, I would say we still need to focus on civic education and making sure that that's key. And that's regardless of age, whether you're a young voter, first time voting, you're going to need civic education. And as well as if you are already a veteran voter, voted for many years, and an older, an adult, I think civic education is something we can always improve and we can always do better with. Forms of media and social media also develop. So should always invest in civic education.